rainy night when I found myself waiting at the old train station on the outskirts of town. The station was nearly abandoned, with only a single dim light flickering above the wooden benches. The air smelled of damp wood and rusting metal, and the only sounds were the distant howling of the wind and the occasional screech of rats scurrying between the tracks. I had missed my last train home, and the next one wasn't scheduled for another 2 hours. My phone battery was nearly dead, and there was no one else around. The ticket booth was closed, and the small waiting room was locked. I sighed, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I sat on a bench, staring at the empty platform. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. The timetable on the wall listed trains that didn't exist. Trains scheduled for odd times, like 2:37 a.m. or 4:13 a.m., long past when the station was supposed to be closed. The destinations were places I had never heard of: Black Hollow, Silent Pines, and Raven's End. I frowned, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I was just tired. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. It was a soft tapping sound, like footsteps echoing against the wet concrete. I turned around quickly, expecting to see another passenger, but the platform was empty. The sound continued for a moment before stopping abruptly. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up, glancing around nervously. The station was eerily still, the wind having died down completely. That's when I noticed something even stranger: the old clock hanging above the platform. It had been stuck at 11:47 p.m. since I arrived, but now the second hand was moving backward, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until it became a blur. A shiver ran down my spine as I backed away from the bench. My instincts told me to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The roads were dark and empty, and I had no way to call for a ride. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe the old station was just playing tricks on my mind. Then I heard it. A distant whistle echoed through the night, growing louder with each passing second. I looked down the tracks, expecting to see a train approaching, but there were no headlights cutting through the darkness. Instead, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the tracks and the platform. My breath hitched as the mist coiled around my feet like grasping fingers. The whistle shrieked again, deafeningly loud now, and suddenly a train emerged from the fog. But something was horribly wrong. The train was ancient, its metal exterior rusted and covered in grime. Its windows were pitch black, reflecting nothing, and the doors rattled as if something inside was desperately trying to get out. The wheels screeched against the tracks as it slowed to a stop in front of me, though I hadn't seen this train listed on the schedule. I took a hesitant step back. The doors slid open with a groan, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like blood. I gagged, covering my nose. Then a voice whispered from inside, "Come aboard." It wasn't a normal voice. It was layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. The words slithered into my ears, sending ice through my veins. My legs trembled, but I couldn't move. Something about that darkness inside the train felt alive, pulsing, waiting. A shadow moved just beyond the threshold. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its gaze burning into me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to listen. I felt an invisible force pulling me forward, my feet sliding against the damp concrete. "No," I managed to whisper, shaking my head. The rain let out a long, shuddering groan, like it was disappointed. The doors slammed shut, and the engine roared to life. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As the train pulled away, I caught a glimpse of something in the window, a reflection, but not mine. It was a man, or what used to be a man. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes hollow black pits. His mouth was twisted into a wide grin, showing jagged, rotting teeth. He raised a skeletal hand, pressing it against the glass as the train disappeared into the fog. Then silence. The air felt heavier, the station darker than before. The clock above the platform had stopped completely. I sat down on the bench, my hands shaking. Had I imagined it? Had I fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing? Just as I was trying to convince myself it wasn't real, I noticed something lying on the ground where the train had been. A single, tattered ticket. I picked it up with trembling fingers, my breath catching in my throat. It was for a destination I had never seen before. Raven's End. My heart pounded as I dropped the ticket. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to be anywhere near it. A cold gust of wind swept through the station, carrying the ticket away into the dark. And then, far in the distance, I heard the whistle again. I sat frozen on the bench, my body refusing to move. The wind howled through the empty station, carrying with it the distant echo of the train's whistle. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I tried to process what had just happened. The train wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the scent of decay still clung to the air, and the memory of that thing's reflection in the window was burned into my mind. I needed to leave. Gripping the edge of the bench, I forced myself to stand, my legs weak and shaky. The next train, the real train, would be here in an hour. I just had to hold on. I looked around, half expecting to see anyone appear, but the station remained empty. The only movement came from the flickering light above me, casting long, twisted shadows along the platform. I glanced at the train schedule again. My eyes immediately locked onto something new. My destination, my actual train, was gone. The listing had changed. Now only one destination remained. Raven's End. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That wasn't right. That train was never supposed to stop here. I took a deep breath and rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. When I looked again, the schedule was normal. My train was back on the list. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. I paced the platform, my footsteps echoing through the empty station. Every few minutes I glanced at the tracks, expecting another ghostly train to appear. But the fog had cleared, and everything seemed quiet again. Then I saw him. A man stood at the far end of the platform near the broken vending machine. He wore a long, tattered coat, his head tilted slightly downward so I couldn't see his face. He hadn't been there a moment ago. My heart skipped a beat. I took a cautious step forward. "Hey!" My voice was barely more than a whisper. The man didn't move. I swallowed hard. Something about him felt wrong, unnatural. I took another step, my eyes locked on his still figure. "Sir, do you need help?" No response. The air around me grew colder. I could see my breath now, small puffs of white in the dim station light. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to turn and run. Then, the man twitched. His head snapped to the side, his body jerking unnaturally. My stomach turned. It wasn't a normal movement. It was sharp, sudden, like something had pulled his strings. Slowly, he lifted his head. I wish I had never seen his face. His skin was gray and stretched tight over his skull. His eyes were hollow, endless pits of darkness that seemed to pull me in. His mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, jagged and too wide for his face. Then he took a step forward. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't stop. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step echoing louder than the last. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran. I sprinted toward the station's exit, but my footsteps felt heavy, like I was running through deep water. The door was only a few feet away. I could make it. I had to make it. Then, the whistle shrieked again. I skidded to a stop as a sudden gust of wind nearly knocked me off my feet. The station trembled, the lights flickering wildly. A deep, guttural groan echoed through the air, shaking the very ground beneath me. I turned back toward the platform, and my blood ran cold. The train had returned. It wasn't on the tracks. It was hovering inches above them, its rusted metal frame vibrating as though it was barely holding itself together. The doors slid open with an unnatural creak, revealing the same pitch-black void inside. The smell of rotten blood filled my nose, making me gag. The man was gone, but something else was standing at the edge of the platform. A shadow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its arms too long, its fingers ending in sharp curved claws. Its face was featureless except for two glowing white eyes, staring directly at me. I couldn't move. The shadow raised one hand and slowly pointed at me. A force stronger than anything I had ever felt gripped my body. My legs moved against my will. Step by step, I was being pulled toward the train. I tried to resist. I screamed. I fought. But it was useless. The shadow tilted its head, almost as if it was amused. The closer I got to the train, the colder it became. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurring. The air around me crackled, thick with something unnatural. I reached the edge of the platform. The shadow lowered its hand, and the force stopped. I collapsed onto my knees, gasping for air. My body was trembling, my hands numb from the cold. The train let out another deep groan, and the doors slammed shut. Then, it was gone. The moment the train disappeared, warmth returned to the air. The station lights flickered once before stabilizing. The heavy silence lifted, replaced by the distant hum of the city beyond. I forced myself to my feet, my entire body shaking. Oh, I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside the station, until the cold, damp air was replaced by the warmth of streetlights and the sound of distant cars. I never took that train, and I never returned to that station. But sometimes in the dead of night when the city is quiet, I still hear it, the whistle, calling for me. I never went back to that train station. I avoided it like a plague, choosing longer routes, paying extra for taxis, anything to make sure I never set foot on that platform again. But even distance wasn't enough. The memories never faded. The sound of that whistle haunted my dreams, always distant, always calling. Some nights I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, ears ringing with the echo of screeching metal and hissing steam. And sometimes, just sometimes, I would hear it even when I was awake. It didn't matter where I was, at work, in a crowded cafe, even in the safety of my own apartment. That low, haunting whistle would drift through the air, always distant, but always there. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. That train was still looking for me. One night, I made a terrible mistake. I stayed out too late, lost track of time, and the last bus had already left. I had no choice but to take the train. Not from that station, never from that station, but from one I had used 1,000 times before. It was safe, normal, busy, even late at night. At least it should have been. The moment I stepped onto the platform, I felt it. The air was thick, heavy, wrong. The usual noise of the city had faded into an eerie silence. The few people waiting for the train seemed off. They stood unnaturally still, heads bowed, faces hidden in shadow. A cold shiver ran through me. The whistle blew. Not the normal train whistle. That whistle. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. The train was arriving, but it wasn't the one I was expecting. It was the same rusted, rotting metal, the same dark windows reflecting nothing, the same doors rattling as if something inside was desperate to escape. I stepped back. I wasn't going to board. I wasn't going to make that mistake. Then I felt it. A hand, cold, bony fingers gripping my wrist. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. It was the man from the station, the one with the hollow eyes and the too-wide grin. "You missed your train last time," he whispered, his voice crawling into my ears. "It's come back for you." The doors opened. The wind howled. The hands pulled. I screamed. And then, nothing. Darkness. Silence. When I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else. Somewhere cold. Somewhere forgotten. The platform stretched into endless shadows, the tracks disappearing into an abyss. The station sign was rusted and broken, but I could still read the words. Raven's End. I was here. I had arrived. And the train had finally taken me. It was a cold winter night when I found myself at an old, nearly abandoned train station. The last train had just left, and I was alone, waiting for the midnight train. The station was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the occasional wind howling through the cracks of the old building. The flickering yellow lights above cast long, twisted shadows on the ground. I looked at my watch. It was 11:45 p.m. The train was supposed to arrive at midnight, but something felt off. The station looked as if it had been forgotten by time. The paint on the walls was peeling, the benches were covered in dust, and the ticket counter was empty. Even the timetable on the wall was faded, showing old schedules from years ago. A cold chill ran down my spine. I pulled my coat tighter and walked to the edge of the platform, looking down the dark, empty tracks. The rails seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, disappearing into thick fog. I had an uneasy feeling in my chest, but I tried to ignore it. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart pounded as I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The station was empty. I swallowed hard and tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. Maybe the wind had moved something. I sat on the bench waiting. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The silence was overwhelming. Then I heard a whisper. A faint, almost unintelligible voice calling my name. My blood ran cold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just silence. I stood up, looking around. The station seemed even darker now. I could feel something watching me, but I couldn't see anything. My breath came out in short, nervous gasps. The whispering continued, growing louder, surrounding me. I grabbed my bag and decided to leave. I didn't care about the midnight train anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A train was approaching, but it was no ordinary train. It was old, covered in rust, and moving silently along the tracks. No engine sound, no screeching of wheels, just an unnatural silence. The windows were dark, but I could see faint shadows moving inside. My legs felt like stone, unable to move. The train stopped in front of me, and the doors slid open with a slow, painful creak. Cold air rushed out, sending shivers down my spine. I knew I shouldn't get on, but something was pulling me toward it. I stepped forward, peering inside. The train was empty, at least, that's what I thought at first. Then I saw them, figures sitting in the dark seats, their faces pale and expressionless. Their eyes were hollow, staring straight ahead. I stepped back, my heart racing. The figures all turned their heads toward me at the same time, their mouths moving silently. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their lips formed a single word. "Come." I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that nightmare. But the train whistle blew, loud and piercing, and the ground beneath me trembled. I looked back just in time to see the figures standing, moving toward the open door. I sprinted toward the exit of the station, but the doors that had been open just moments ago were now shut. I banged on them, screaming for help, but no one answered. The whispering returned, louder now, filling my ears. "Come with us. Come with us." I turned around, pressing my back against the cold door. The figures were stepping off the train now, moving toward me with slow, unnatural movements. Their feet never made a sound against the concrete. My vision blurred with panic. I pressed my eyes shut, willing it all to be a nightmare. But when I opened them, they were right in front of me. Pale hands reached for me, ice-cold fingers grazing my skin. I screamed, and then everything went black. I woke up on the platform. The station was empty again. No train, no figures, just silence. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet. My bag was still beside me, untouched. I looked at my watch. 11:45 p.m. Had I imagined everything? Had I fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing? The sound of an approaching train made me jump, but this time it was a normal train, sleek and modern, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The midnight train. Shaking, I picked up my bag and stepped toward the platform. The train stopped and the doors opened, but as I stepped forward, I saw something that made my breath catch. In the window of the train, a reflection stared back at me. It was me, but behind me stood the figures from the ghost train, their hollow eyes still watching. The doors slid shut, the train pulled away, and I knew I would never leave this station. I stood frozen on the platform, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I watched the train disappear into the fog. The moment it vanished, an eerie silence swallowed the station once again. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the place itself was suffocating me. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. The figures were gone, but deep inside, I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. I needed to get out. I ran to the exit doors, but they were locked. I banged my fists against the glass, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the stillness. There was no one outside, no signs of life beyond the station walls. The entire town seemed to have vanished. A loud screeching noise made me whip around. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, coming from somewhere deep within the station. My body trembled, my instincts screaming at me to run. But where? There was nowhere to go. Then the lights flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, I saw them. The figures were standing on the platform again, closer than before. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Their mouths moved in silent whispers, their cold breath fogging the air. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the door. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice cracking. They didn't stop. They moved in unison, slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to find an escape, but there was none. I was trapped. Then, the station clock chimed. Midnight. The entire station shuddered, the walls trembling as if something massive had awakened beneath us. The fog outside thickened, swirling unnaturally, creeping onto the platform like grasping fingers. A low, guttural voice echoed through the station. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You missed the train." My blood ran cold. The figures stopped just inches away from me. One of them, taller than the rest, lifted a hand and pointed at the tracks. I didn't want to look, but something forced me to turn my head. Another train was approaching. But this one wasn't like the midnight train. It was ancient, rusted, its metal frame barely holding together. Sparks flew from its wheels as it screeched along the tracks. The front of the train was covered in grime, but beneath the filth, I could see something. Faces. Twisted, screaming faces pressed against the metal, their mouths open in silent agony. My stomach twisted in horror. The train slowed as it reached the platform, coming to a stop with a deafening hiss. The doors opened, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A wave of icy air poured out, making my skin prickle. The tall figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. It didn't speak, but I heard its voice inside my head. "Get on." I shook my head violently. "No, I won't." The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. The other figures inched closer, their bony fingers reaching for me. My body felt heavy, my limbs numb. It was as if something was pulling me toward the train, dragging me into the darkness. I dug my heels into the ground, fighting against the invisible force. "Please, let me go," I screamed. The tall figure tilted its head, as if considering my plea. Then, it took another step forward. Its cold, dead fingers grazed my wrist, and in that instant, I saw everything. I saw the train station as it once was, bright, bustling with life. People waiting, laughing, talking. The midnight train arriving on time, passengers boarding without fear. Then, I saw the accident. A train derailed, screams, fire, bodies crushed beneath twisted metal. A night of terror that had erased the station from history. Forgotten by the world, but not by the dead. I gasped, yanking my arm away from the figure's grip. They weren't ghosts. They were trapped, and they wanted me to join them. The force pulling me toward the train grew stronger. The whispers became deafening, voices crying, begging, demanding. The figures surrounded me, their hands closing in. "No, please." I struggled, but it was useless. The darkness of the train yawned open before me, endless, consuming. Then, a blinding light. The station trembled violently. The figures shrieked, their hollow eyes widening in fear. The force holding me loosened, and I collapsed onto the cold platform. I looked up, dazed, as another train pulled into the station, the real midnight train. Its headlights cut through the fog, its modern silver body gleaming. The doors slid open, revealing a bright, empty interior. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Last call for the midnight train. All aboard." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and ran. I could hear the figures screaming behind me, their wails echoing through the station. Hands reached for me, but I was faster. I leapt onto the train just as the doors shut behind me. The train lurched forward. I turned to the window, my breath catching in my throat. The figures stood on the platform, watching as the train pulled away. The tall one lifted a hand, as if waving goodbye. And then, the station disappeared into the darkness. I collapsed into a seat, my entire body trembling. The train was warm, real. The soft hum of the engine, the gentle sway of the car, it was real. I was safe. As the train sped away, I knew one thing for certain. That station had been a place lost in time, trapped in an endless loop of horror, and if I had missed that train again, I would have been lost with it, forever. The train sped forward, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks calming my racing heart. I leaned back against the seat, my breath still uneven, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly that my fingers ached. My mind struggled to process everything that had happened. The ghostly figures, the derailed train, the twisted voices that had tried to pull me into their nightmare. I glanced around the cabin, expecting to see other passengers, but it was completely empty. No conductor, no ticket collectors, no one. Just rows of vacant seats stretching into the dimly lit interior. The silence felt unnatural, almost oppressive, but at least I was no longer at that cursed station. I pulled out my phone, desperate to contact someone, anyone. But the screen was blank. No signal, no Wi-Fi, no time displayed. It was as if my phone had stopped functioning the moment I boarded the train. My stomach clenched in unease. I turned to look out the window, hoping to see familiar landmarks. But instead of the expected cityscape or countryside, I saw nothing but darkness. Thick, endless darkness. The train was moving, but through what? There were no lights outside, no tunnels, no passing towns. Just an abyss that swallowed everything beyond the glass. A shiver ran down my spine. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Maybe it's just fog," I whispered, though I didn't believe my own words. Then I saw it. A reflection in the glass. At first I thought it was just my own, distorted by the dim light. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, while I sat frozen. The figure was behind me. Cold terror washed over me. I turned my head in a swift, jerking motion, but the seat behind me was empty. My breath hitched. I glanced back at the window, and the reflection was gone. Something was very, very wrong. I stood up on shaky legs, gripping the nearest seat for support. The train continued moving forward at a steady pace, but now the air inside felt heavier. It was as if I was being watched, unseen eyes pressing in from all directions. I needed to find someone. A conductor, a passenger, anyone. I stepped into the aisle, my footsteps unnaturally loud against the silence. Then a sound, a whisper. It came from further down the train, just beyond the next set of doors. A soft, distant voice calling my name. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to sit down and pretend I hadn't heard it. But some force, curiosity, fear, or something far worse, compelled me to move forward. With a trembling hand, I reached for the door and slid it open. The next cabin was identical to the one I had just left. Empty seats, dim lights, eerie silence. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something chilling. The advertisements on the walls, the safety instructions, they were old. Yellowed with age, featuring faded images of people dressed in clothes from decades ago. The posters that had once held cheerful messages now had peeling edges, the ink smudged as if time had worn them. The air was colder here. My mouth formed a faint mist as I exhaled. I took another step. A shadow flickered at the far end of the cabin. A shape, just out of focus, moving between the seats. "Hello?" My voice wavered. No answer. I swallowed hard and continued forward. The whispering returned, surrounding me, words I couldn't understand. The closer I got to the end of the cabin, the louder they became. Then I saw it. A figure slumped in a seat, facing away from me. Their hair was long and tangled, their clothes torn and faded. The whispering seemed to come from them, though their lips weren't moving. I felt like I was drowning in the silence. Every instinct told me to run, but I had to know. I reached out slowly, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the figure's shoulder. "Excuse me," I barely whispered. The moment my fingers brushed the fabric of their coat, the figure's head snapped around unnaturally fast. Their face was pale, hollow eyes staring straight into mine. Their mouth opened, wider than humanly possible, stretching into a void of darkness. I stumbled back, my scream caught in my throat. The whispers turned into an ear-piercing shriek as the figure lunged at me. I turned and ran, slamming through the door back into the previous cabin. But it wasn't the same anymore. The seats were torn, the lights flickered erratically, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if something had been trapped here for years. I kept running, pushing through door after door, but the train was changing. Each cabin was more decayed, more twisted than the last. The windows were now covered in grime, the outside world completely lost in darkness. Then up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The tall figure from the station. It stood in the middle of the aisle, waiting. I skidded to a stop, my chest heaving. The figure tilted its head, those hollow eyes locked onto me. Then slowly, it raised one hand and pointed at me. The train screeched violently, the walls trembling with a deafening roar, as if the train itself was coming apart. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the station platform. The real one. The lights were bright, the air was cold, and a normal train was pulling in. People bustled around me, unaware of what had just happened. My hands shook as I gripped the bench, trying to steady myself. Had it all been a nightmare? A hallucination? But then I saw it. A reflection in the train window. The figures were still there. Watching. Waiting. And as the train doors opened, I heard the whisper once more. This time it was inside my head. "You will return." I sat frozen on the cold metal bench, my body numb with fear. The world around me felt real, the bright station lights, the distant hum of city life, the sound of people moving about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The normal train stood before me, its doors open, inviting passengers inside. People boarded casually, chatting, laughing, unaware of the horror I had just escaped. But had I really escaped? My eyes flickered to the reflection in the train window again. The figures were still there, just beyond the glass, their hollow eyes staring at me. They didn't move, they didn't breathe, they just watched. "You will return." The voice echoed in my mind, cold and certain. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my bag and stood up, my legs weak and shaky. The normal train was my way out, my only chance to leave this cursed station behind. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward and boarded. The doors slid shut behind me with a soft hiss. The train jolted forward, moving smoothly along the tracks. I exhaled, trying to steady my thoughts. The inside of the train was brightly lit, clean, and modern. People sat in their seats, scrolling through their phones or staring out the windows. I took a seat near the door, gripping my bag tightly. Everything felt normal now, but I knew better. The nightmare wasn't over. I cautiously glanced at the window beside me. My reflection stared back, exhausted and pale. But this time, there was nothing behind me. No figures, no shadows. Maybe I really had escaped. I closed my eyes, resting my head against the cool glass. The soft hum of the train, the steady movement, it was comforting. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to breathe. But then, the lights flickered. My eyes shot open. My stomach twisted into a knot. No, not again. The passengers didn't react. Completely oblivious, as if nothing had happened. The train lights flickered again, longer this time. The hum of the engine stuttered, the world outside the window blurring into darkness. Panic clawed at my chest. I turned to the man sitting across from me. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice strained. He didn't respond. I leaned forward. "Hey, are you okay?" Slowly he turned his head toward me. My blood ran cold. His face was wrong. His eyes were dull, lifeless, his skin gray and unnatural. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He just stared. I jerked back in horror. I looked around at the other passengers. One by one, they all turned their heads toward me. Their eyes were hollow. Their mouths hung open in silent screams. The train lurched violently. The windows darkened completely, the world outside swallowed by the abyss. The familiar whisper returned, growing louder, pressing against my skull. "You will return." The train wasn't taking me home, it was taking me back. I shot up from my seat, stumbling down the aisle. The passengers' heads followed my movement, their lifeless gazes burning into me. I didn't care. I had to get out. I reached the nearest door and slammed my hands against it, but it wouldn't budge. The emergency exit handle, gone. The intercom, dead. The train jerked again, throwing me forward. I landed hard on the floor, pain shooting through my knees. Then I saw it. At the far end of the train car, a door slid open, and the tall figure stepped inside. It moved slowly, deliberately. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine. Its presence sucked the air from the room, filling every inch of space with an unbearable pressure. The train's light whirled into a nightmare. The shifting. The passengers began to rise from their seats. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. I had to get out. I had to escape before. The train screeched, metal twisting, the walls trembling. And suddenly, I wasn't on the train anymore. I was back at the station. The cold air hit me like a slap. The train, the normal one, was still there, still boarding passengers like nothing had happened. People moved around me, unaware. The real world had returned, but I knew the truth. This wasn't over. The figures were still watching, and I could still hear the whisper, buried deep in my mind. "You will return." I don't know when, but I know one thing for certain. The next time I find myself at that station, I won't escape. I stood there breathless, staring at the train in front of me. The normal train, the real one. The doors were still open, passengers still boarding, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just been dragged through a nightmare. My legs felt weak, my entire body trembling from the terror still coursing through my veins. I could leave now. I could get on that train, go home, and try to forget everything. But deep inside, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. The figures were still there, hidden in the reflections, lingering in the corners of my mind. I could feel them watching, waiting. I took a shaky step toward the train. The intercom crackled. "Final call, all aboard." I hesitated. A chill crept down my spine, an unnatural cold that didn't belong in the real world. I forced myself to look at the train window one last time. For a moment I saw nothing, just my own reflection, pale and exhausted. Then, a shape flickered behind me. A hand, reaching. The doors hissed. The train was about to leave. I clenched my fists, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The doors slid shut behind me. The train lurched forward, moving smoothly along the tracks. I didn't look back, but as I settled into my seat, I couldn't shake the feeling